Hi there, everyone. Mychal Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology with your Capricorn Ingress reading for the year 2024. Now, I know that most people are accustomed to an Aries Ingress chart being used as the predictive chart for the year ahead, and that is true too. However, within the context of Uranian astrology, we take a look at the Capricorn Ingress as being the predictive chart for the year ahead because that kind of makes more sense from an astronomical perspective. Now, this is something that's kind of a contentious topic, and it was even a contentious topic back in the 90s when we were trying to decide what day should be International Astrology Day. At the moment, International Astrology Day got pinned onto March 21st because that's the vernal equinox, but there was also a very large faction of our astrological kingdom who wanted International Astrology Day to be December 21st because when the sun ingresses into Capricorn, the sun has his lowest possible declination in relationship to the celestial equator. That means that today the sun is as far south from the celestial equator as he will ever be. Quite similar to the Cancer ingress when the sun is as far north from the celestial equator as he will ever be. At the Cancer ingress, we have the longest day of the year called the summer solstice, and on December 21st, we have the longest night of the year called the winter solstice. So this recording is being done today on the winter solstice. So happy winter solstice for all of you who are either here live or all of you who will listen to this later. And truthfully, this is the moment that the sun makes his journey back towards the celestial equator. And when the sun returns to the celestial equator to the exact crossing of his orbital path, which we call the ecliptic, and the celestial equator, that is known as the vernal equinox. However, from an astronomical perspective, the sun is already 1/4 through his journey on the first day of spring, whereas today, December 21st, is where the sun's journey actually begins. So this is why many people, and I don't just think this is a Uranian astrology phenomenon, I think this is a life astrology phenomenon. This is why many people consider December 21st to be the actual astrological new year, even though March 21st is the beginning of spring. And the reason for that is because this is when the sun begins making his journey back to the vernal equinox, which qualifies as the beginning of spring. So hopefully that wasn't too much astronomy and hopefully you were able to hold on to some of that. But the point of the matter is we can technically use any ingress chart of the sun ingressing into a sign to represent a particular period of time. So truthfully, when the sun ingresses into Aries, while for the most part we take that as being a predictive chart for the year ahead, we can also take that as being a predictive chart for the springtime. Similarly, when the sun ingresses into Cancer, while there are some people who take that as being a predictive chart for the next 6 months, we can also use the sun's ingress into Cancer as a predictive chart for the 3 months of the summer. And the same is true also for the Libra ingress, where we have the sun ingressing into Libra roughly around September 21st. And the same is also true for the Capricorn ingress, where we have the sun ingressing into Capricorn roughly around December 21st, where we can use this chart today as being an ingress chart or a predictive chart for the next 3 months ahead. So technically speaking, from an astrological perspective, we're not even really supposed to just use the Aries ingress as being the be-all and the end-all for the year ahead, because we should really be having these moments of prediction at every major ingress of the sun into the 4 cardinal signs of Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. Now, some people might say, well, I'm a Taurus. What about when the sun ingresses into Taurus? Can I use that as a potential ingress? And technically speaking, the answer should be yes. However, we tend not to view the sun's ingress into the non-cardinal signs as being as significant as the sun's ingress into the cardinal cardinal signs. So with that being said, that is the basis of why we're using this Capricorn ingress as really being our primary annual predictive chart for the year ahead. And it just kind of feels a little bit nicer too, because we're all in this state of preparing for the new year from the perspective of our modern calendar. And so it is kind of nice to have something that we can use as a point of insight into the year ahead based on this Capricorn ingress chart. However, we will also be coming out with the Aries ingress report on the vernal equinox for those of you who need that in your lives as well, because I know that old habits die hard. And I'm also saying that specifically for me because I also kind of need my Aries ingress update as well. So we'll be doing the Aries ingress as a means of taking a look at what will happen within the world predictively within the 3 months of the spring. So whether or not you choose to use this Capricorn ingress chart today as a means of taking a look at what will happen in the year ahead, or even if you choose to use this as a means of taking a look at what will happen within the next 3 months, the point of the matter is this chart is a very vital predictive tool for us to gain some level of insight into the future. We're going to be starting by taking a look at the traditional chart, just because I think that the traditional chart is a bit of a universal equalizer. We all tend to have some sort of understanding about how to look at a traditional astrological chart, but we're also going to be taking a look at the Capricorn ingress. Since the Capricorn ingress is such a big deal within Uranian astrology, we're also going to be taking a look at the Capricorn ingress using our Uranian astrology dials as well, which I hope you'll be okay with, because Uranian astrology really is an astrology that focuses on the prediction of concrete mundane events. And it actually began as a system of concrete mundane astrology. And the reason I've been bringing our Uranian astrology teachings so much more to the forefront of what we do here on the Oraculos Podcast is because we have our upcoming Uranian Astrology for Practicing Astrologers Intensive, which begins this January 30th, 2024. For a long time, I was speaking to people about the intensive as if Uranian astrology was the actual goal of the intensive, but the actual goal is to teach us how to practice astrology from a more planetary perspective. In the 21st century, we all kind of know how to take a look at the chart and add up the elements and add up the genders and add up the modalities and add up the everything. We know how to do that type of astrology. We know how to take a look at the chart and interpret it primarily through the signs of the zodiac. These are things that we tend to have a certain modicum of mastery around within the 21st century. We know how to look at the chart and say what it means, if it's a bucket or if it's a kite or if it's the finger of God or if it looks like whatever. We know how to do these larger brushstrokes when it comes to chart delineation, but the area where we tend to struggle more with is understanding how to concretely determine and describe what it means for multiple planets to be having a conversation with each other. And that's really my main intention, not just in terms of integrating the Uranian astrology into this specific predictive forecast, but also that's my intention in the upcoming intensive that we have, because I want to live in an astrological world where we're able to have more nuanced conversations about the planets. So if mastering the aspects is something that you want to do, if you want to know how to speak in a detailed, concrete way about the combinations of 2 planets, 3 planets, 4 planets, 6 planets, all coming together to concretely describe an event happening within our material world, and if that's a part of your astrological practice that you still feel you tend to struggle with, or if you just want more tools to help you really understand the planets in a deep and profound way so that you can understand how to read a chart more from a planetary perspective than a zodiacal perspective, then by all means, join us in our upcoming Uranian Astrology for Practicing Astrologers Intensive, which begins this coming January 2024. And in February, we have our Astrocartography, Finding You in the Universe Intensive, for those of you who want to take this idea of planet-based astrology even further. Astrocartography is another passion of mine, and I'm a certified astrocartographer, which I just realized the other day there are only 115 certified astrocartographers in the entire world since the beginning of astrocartography. And I kind of thought that that was kind of unbelievable. So I want to flood the universe with astrocartographers this year, 2024. And the astrocartography exam is only given in June. So if you want to become an astrocartographer, become one of the literally only certified astrocartographers on the planet, or if you just want to know how to take a look at a map and see, based on the crossing of various planetary lines, which places correspond with your highest abundance, success, health, vitality, and the things that actually allow you to thrive more fully within the world, then join us this February 2024 for our upcoming Astrocartography Finding You in the Universe Intensive. Now, without further ado, let's dive into our Capricorn Ingress forecast for the year 2024. And if you're not comfortable with that, then at least for the next 3 months, this Capricorn Ingress is going to be a valid predictive piece for us to pay attention to. Do enjoy. All right, so here we have our Capricorn Ingress chart for December 21st, 2023 at 10:27:08 p.m. EST for Washington, D.C. Now, just a little bit of insight into why this chart is erected for Washington, D.C. The reality is that if we're erecting a chart at all, we have to erect it for a location. So we're going to be taking a look at this chart on the one hand, within the first portion of our forecast for Washington, D.C., so that we can take a look at what some of these astrological combinations mean and how they line up for the United States of America within this coming year. However, when we go over to the 360-degree dial, that allows us to purely look at the planetary combinations so that we can see how those combinations are going to line up for the world in general. So this chart gives us insight specifically into the destiny of America for the next year. But the dial, one of the benefits of Uranian astrology is because we don't have the same sort of relationship to houses in Uranian astrology as we do within traditional astrology, the dial allows us to focus more specifically on the combinations of planets, their hard aspect relationships, and how those hard aspect relationships reflect concrete events that are going to occur within our world within the coming year. Another point before we begin is that, as you can see, I'm also using Regiomontanus houses within this. And the reason for that is because a lot of my astrology is rooted in the 17th century, and Regiomontanus was the house system of choice during that period of time. So therefore, since we're looking at this from a traditional perspective, I'm using Regiomontanus houses in order to accomplish that. And just in case anybody wants to know, I'm also using the mean node, and that's because unlike the true node, the mean node was the lunar node that was used within the 17th century as well. Whereas today, in the 21st century, we have this option of using either the mean node or the true node. In the 17th century, we primarily used the mean node. All right, so on the screen, we see that we have 10 degrees of Virgo, 0 minutes rising at the moment that the sun ingressed into Capricorn. And so that means that within the context of this chart, Mercury is going to be the quote-unquote ruler of the first house. Now, within a mundane astrology chart such as this, one of the first things that we focus on is the people, or how the people of a particular country are going to respond this year, or what their overall state is going to be this year. And from a traditional perspective, our first default for the people of a country is going to be the ruler of the ascendant. And that technically stands true in most versions of traditional astrology, whether it's horary astrology or natal astrology or electional astrology or event astrology, the person who has the chart is going to be represented by the ascendant and its lord. So here within this chart, we see that Mercury is at 1 degree Capricorn, 32 minutes retrograde here in the fourth house. What the fourth house means from a mundane astrology perspective is it has to do with the land, the actual landed property of a particular country, the assets that are associated with that land, the buildings that are associated with that land, the taxes that are associated with that land, people's ability to house themselves affordably. All of these things have to do with the fourth house. So within this year, we see the rule of the ascendant in the fourth house. And so that's already giving us some indications that the topics of housing, the housing market in general, people's ability to afford where they live, the actual reality of what's going on the ground in the US is going to be a major point of consideration for the people of this country. Now, within this chart, we see that the Mercury is at 1 degree Capricorn and also retrograde. There's an aphorism within traditional astrology that says that a planet retrograde is like a man infirm, stupefied, and solicitous. So what that means is that regardless of what the essential dignity of Mercury might be, the fact that Mercury is retrograde is saying that Mercury himself, and by extension, the people on the ground this year, may not necessarily feel as if they have all of the resources necessary to take care of themselves, particularly when it comes to their fourth house affairs. Fourth house affairs, once again, being the affordability of housing, being the reality of what's going on with property, how property is being allocated and distributed within the country this year could be a very tricky topic for people because the people may not necessarily feel as if they have the ability to take care of themselves or as if they have the ability to really hold on to their property in the way that they want to. And maybe that doesn't have to do with anybody individually. Maybe there could be a wider movement within the government this year that's causing the relationship of the American people to American soil to be something that is a little bit more challenging, or to be something that is a little bit more difficult for us to really wrap our minds around, or for us to really feel comfortable within. Now, another thing that I think is significant about this is that the Mercury is also ruling the 10th house. And as we know, the 10th house also has to do with the government and our elected government officials, and it also has to do with the president, particularly in countries that have presidents such as the United States of America. Having the ruler of the ascendant as the ruler of the 10th house in the 4th house is saying this isn't just a domestic issue that's manifesting within the heart of the people, but this is also a set of issues where we find the government this year is going to primarily be focused. So the main topic on the agenda this year might be the topic of housing, might be the topic of real estate, natural resources, and how we interact with the land in general, and also how people have a sense of even belonging on this land. There's something interesting about the 4th house where we also find a real sense of homegrown nationalism becoming a very big 4th house theme, especially within years where we find the 4th house so strongly emphasized as we see it emphasized within this chart. So there could be a very real sense of nationalism, or a very deep spirit of nationalism that people have this year, possibly because they feel as if aspects of their sovereignty or aspects of what it means to be an American within this year are being threatened. And the reason why I use this language of being threatened is because we do have the ruler of the ascendant and the ruler of the 10th house retrograde in the 4th house, which means there could be a feeling of, while we are rooting ourselves in this 4th house, we still don't necessarily feel as safe as we want to feel, or we still don't necessarily feel as grounded as we want to feel, or it still doesn't feel as good as it should feel. It should feel wonderful for us to be in our own home. However, I'm retrograde within my home, which means that I still feel as if there's a part of me that's in need of help or in need of support or in need of assistance or that's begging or that's solicitous or that isn't quite comfortable with how things are being done on the ground within my country within this year. So this is something that we find with the rule of the ascendant in the fourth house in the sort of disposition that it's in. Now, the other thing that's significant about this chart is that we also have the sun in the fourth house. Now, this is a solar ingress chart into Capricorn, which means that we care about where the sun is in this chart in any event. As many of you know who've been listening to me for more than one episode, my favorite word at the Oraculos School of Astrology is corroboration. So we've already said that the land is going to be a very big topic for the people this year as a result of having the ruler of the first house and the ruler of the 10th house here as Mercury retrograde in the fourth house. So what do we do with that information? We find ways to corroborate what has already been said. So how we can corroborate that is by saying the sun, the most important sun, the all-important sun, who we're even casting this chart for to begin with, is also in the fourth house, which is a further corroborative fact that says to us that the land, real estate, property taxes, all of these things become a very big item for the people of the United States of America within this coming year. And once again, even if it's just what we're starting the year off with within the next 3 months, the point is that this is still a big ticket item within the year 2024. So having the sun within the fourth house is a further corroboration of the fact that the land, the quality of the land, people's ability to have free access to the land, people's ability to feel as if they can support themselves on the land in their physical homes is going to be a very big ticket item with the sun and the ruler of the ascendant and the ruler of the 10th house here within the fourth house. Now, within this chart, the sun is specifically ruling the 12th house. And the 12th house, as we know, is the house of hidden enemies and self-undoing. From a natal chart perspective, if we were to look at this chart and see the ruler of the 12th house in the 4th house, we would say to our client that there was something about your domestic life that felt uncomfortable, that represented a major source of wounding within your life within this lifetime, and that also represented something that you probably felt a sense of shame or embarrassment or guilt regarding talking about. So here we have the ruler of the 12th house here within the 4th house. And so what does that mean from a more global perspective? This could also indicate a sense of there being a sense of embarrassment regarding what's going on the soil within the United States of America this year. There could also be a sense of feeling as if the powers that be, or the powers that are meant to support the American land and the American people this year, are actually shooting themselves in the foot as far as things concerning housing, real estate, and democratic action in regards to housing and real estate is concerned. So it doesn't necessarily feel like the most comfortable year on the ground, and it also doesn't necessarily feel like the most comfortable year in terms of those topics of the housing market and in terms of the topic of real estate specifically. And when we look at the government this year being represented by the Mercury retrograde, it gives us a sense that we're shooting ourselves in the foot nationally, and the powers that be, the government that is, doesn't even have the means to counter that action, or it doesn't even have the means to make it right, or it doesn't even have the means to change the potentially challenging trajectory that the people of America find themselves faced with within this coming year as far as these fourth house topics are concerned. Now, from a traditional perspective, having the sun within the fourth house could be a good thing, but it could also be something that has to do with a sense of there not being enough water on the ground in order to actually make the ground watered, basically. So this could be an omen that indicates that we're in for a very hot summer ahead. And This is kind of my PG-13 way of speaking about this topic because clearly the ancients cut no corners when it came to talking about these things. So whereas the ancients would say the word drought, I'm specifically saying that it could be a matter of there not being enough water on the ground in order to nurture the land or in order to fully till the soil. So this could also indicate there being an issue surrounding farming and an issue surrounding the agricultural industry in general because of the quality of the soil or because of the aridity of the soil. So this could be something that we find manifesting within our larger news cycles as we move into 2024, that the ground itself may be untillable or particular staple harvests from the ground are in a potential state of crisis because of the aridity of the ground beneath our feet. To this point of aridity of the ground beneath our feet, this idea of the sun being in a house, burning up the contents of that house, is something that has existed in our most ancients of astrologies since time immemorial. And this is also something that we even find within Indian astrology, where there's this idea that having the sun within the house of children could be one of the things that indicates sterility or a woman's inability to have children, or there just being a larger topic of sterility within that couple in general, where one of them is sterile and they can't actually produce children. Because the sun within the fifth house, from a Western astrology perspective, could indicate a drying up of the native moisture that's necessary to conceive. So technically speaking, the sun in the fifth house, traditionally speaking, isn't necessarily the greatest thing in the world. And clearly, as you all know at this point, in order for us to say anything definitively, we need a number of corroborating factors in order to support the things that we want to say. However, I'll say the next piece because I know that I'm in a room full of intelligent astrologers who aren't going to take things out of context. So having the sun within the fifth house, especially if we have a non-fertile sign on the cusp of the fifth house, can have to do with the person having very few children. And sometimes if we have a fire sign on the cusp of the fifth house and the sun in the fifth house and Mars in the fifth house, it can either have to do with having no children whatsoever or just having one child. And the reason why the sun in the fifth house has to do with one child is because the sun doesn't necessarily allow for other suns to shine around himself. So therefore, the sun in the fifth is a traditional indication of a person who may be having one child within this lifetime. But the larger understanding is that the sun in the fifth is a challenging thing in terms of the moisture that the fifth house is meant to hold for the purpose of giving birth to children. And the same is technically also true for Mars. Mars in the fifth house is also thought to diminish the native moisture necessary for childbirth to occur. The same is true for the second house of money. Having the sun within the second house of money and afflicted there, meaning sun in opposition with Saturn, sun square Saturn, sun square Mars, sun opposing Mars, all of these afflictions to the sun, sun conjunct the south node, having either the sun or Mars in the fifth house is also thought to be afflictive from a traditional natal astrology perspective. Because if the sun and Mars are in the fifth house and not second house, pardon me. So having the sun and Mars in the second house is also thought to be afflictive from a traditional natal astrology perspective, because if the sun or Mars is in the second house and not doing well within that house, meaning they are really afflicted based on other things happening within the chart, that can indicate a person who burns through their money. Sun in the second house can be a person who is making a lot of money and therefore spending just as much money, whereas Mars within the second house has to do with this idea of wasteful prodigality, or a person who burns through their inheritance or they burn through their resources. So the point of the matter is, in the same way as Sun or Mars in the fifth house can burn up the native moisture necessary to give birth, And in the same way as Sun and Mars in the second house can burn up our liquid assets as far as our money is concerned, having Sun and Mars in the fourth house, traditionally speaking, can be an indication of a burning up of the land. And what the ancients thought this indicated was that it could be a year where the weather was uncommonly hot and arid to the point where it had a direct impact on the crops and the agriculture. So these are things that we're seeing within this chart with having both the Sun and Mars here present within the fourth house. Yes, we see the Mars square Neptune, and we're going to talk about the Mars square Neptune later, but the overarching reality is that Mars and the Sun in the fourth house is representing this overheating of the ground beneath our feet. Now, in the most concrete way, that has to do with drought, water shortage, not necessarily being able to take care of the crops in the way that we need to take care of them. However, from a more human-based perspective, this can have to do, particularly the Mars here within the fourth house, can have to do with a sense of there being aggravation, frustration, and upset on the ground. So once again, we're having this sense of a homegrown anxiety or a homegrown frustration or a homegrown aggravation that can actually be explosive in terms of what we see manifesting within the news in the US within this coming year. So having the Mars here within the fourth house, on the one hand, it has to do with there being fire on the ground, but on the other hand, it has to do with the people being inflamed, the people being aggravated, the people being in a state of... The W word has been thrown around quite a bit, especially in recent times. However, Mars is the god of war. And so having Mars here within the fourth house can also have to do with the people being in a state of conflict and not necessarily taking that conflict abroad, but allowing that conflict to be here on the soil of the United States of America. So this whole fourth house situation is a lot contentious. I was going to say a little bit contentious, but it's not a little bit contentious. It's a lot contentious. Now, if we go and take a look at what this Mars is ruling within this chart, which is clearly another thing that we would do from a predictive astrology perspective, we see that this Mars is ruling the third house which has to do with our news and how we are sharing news within the country this year. It also has to do with things like the roads and the railways and the ways how we travel within the country. So there are these two things. It has to do with the news, the newspapers, the magazines, the news networks, all of these things. And it also has to do with our local travel. This Mars is ruling the third house, but it's also ruling the eighth house. As we know, the eighth house is a house of taxes and the eighth house is a house of debt. Now, technically speaking, from a natal perspective, the eighth house is a house of other people's money. But the reality is that very often our interaction with other people's money causes us ourselves to be in a state of debt, or it causes us ourselves to be in a state of desperation because we're depending on other people for their money, which is the same as debt, essentially. So having this Mars present within the fourth house has to do with the fact that, one, our third house topics, particularly as it relates to domestic travel, so the roads, our airways, but things that specifically pertain to travel within the US, as well as taxes, becomes a very big topic. Now, Jean-Baptiste Morin de Villefranche in the 17th century said that determination by location is immediate. And what that means is that a planet's presence in a house is going to be more impactful in that house where it is located than that planet ruling a house elsewhere where it is not located. So what this means is that having this Mars here within the fourth house is specifically significant as far as it's bringing the themes of debt to the fourth house. And the fourth house has to do with the land. So here we see this concept of property taxes once again becoming a major topic within the United States of America, and our overall sense of the money that we owe for this land becomes a very significant topic this year. So what are the debts the country is facing, and how do those larger debts that the country is facing become an actual real world issue on the ground? There's often a lot of talk about the debts of the country, the debts of the country. As a person from the Bahamas, I can tell you many instances where I turn on the radio and we hear talk about the debts of the country. However, these things always seem to be very in the cloud, as it were, and it never really seems to trickle down off of the news into the actual realities of our bank book. However, this could be a year where the debts of the country does trickle down into the reality of people's bank books in a more significant way, and the way in which the country may try to make up for some of its debt. I don't actually know what the current level of debt is in the US, but the way in which the country tries to make up for some of its debt might be in terms of property taxes or homeowners taxes or other taxes that have to do with the realities of people's relationship to their own land and of people's relationship to their real estate. So these are things that we see manifesting within this coming period of time. And I think that the fact that the Mars is also ruling the third house might just be an indication of the fact that this debt, eighth house, is the major thing that we find being spoken about within our news networks, the third house, within this coming year. Or if we were to merge the meanings of the eighth house, the third house, and the fourth house, we can say that debt surrounding property and real estate becomes the major news item within the year of 2024. Now, with that being said, the next thing that I would usually do is I would follow what I call the golden thread. What does that mean in the universe? What that means is that if we have already established a particular momentum regarding a particular topic, then we should keep on pursuing that topic within the chart to see whether or not we find other corroborating pieces of information that also supports our assertions. As astrologers, and I don't even know if I could speak for the whole astrological community, but as for me and my house, we don't really like to be wrong. And so we corroborate our you-know-what's off because we want to find always multiple corroborative factors that stand in support of what is being said. And those corroborative factors cannot come from my spirit guides. They cannot come from my ancestors. They can't even come from my three-legged cat. Those corroborative factors have to come from the realities of what we see going on within the chart itself, which is where all astrology comes from. Astrology is far less intuitive than we think it is because we cannot say anything astrologically if it isn't rooted within the realities of the chart that we're looking at. So within this chart, we've spoken about debt related to the land within this year. So where else are you going to look if not the second house? And lo and behold, as we look at the second house of the American people for the year 2024, we have the South Node present within the second house. Within traditional astrology, there's this understanding that whichever house the South Node is located in is going to be a house that is afflicted. I'm bringing it up because it's in the second house and we're talking about the topic of debt. So within this chart, we find the South Node present here within the second house. And there are certain things that I consider to be toilet bowls of the universe. I was going to write about this in my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, and then I was told that it was unbecoming of an astrologer of my caliber to talk about toilet bowls of the universe. So when it came to the South Node, I changed the language to appease the people. But truthfully, my thoughts about the South Node is that it is a big whopping toilet bowl of the universe, because usually things that drop into the South Node are things that we can't reclaim within our lives. So the South Node is a toilet bowl of the universe for me. The first square to the South Node, which we call the Southern Bending, is another such toilet bowl of the universe for me. The 12th house is a toilet bowl of the universe for me, and Neptune is a toilet bowl of the universe. All of these things are toilet bowls. So Having the South Node in the second house, for me, is technically quite the same as having the ruler of the second house in the 12th house, having Neptune in the second house, having the ruler of the second house conjunct the South Node, having the ruler of the second house at the southern bending. All of these things smell the same to me. They all smell like my money is being washed away. So within this chart, we have the South Node present within the second house. And as you already know, my favorite aphorism in the entire astrological kingdom is that determination by location is immediate, which means that the effect of the South Node within this coming year is going to be felt specifically in the second house. What does this mean? This could indicate that there is a general feeling of there being a hole within the pocket of the American people. Having the South Node in the second house can oftentimes feel as if our money is hemorrhaging away, and as if no matter how much money we make, we still can't seem to hold on to it. This is true in mundane astrology, but it's also true within natal astrology as well, especially if the ruler of your second house is afflicted, such as in this chart, the ruler of the second house is most definitely afflicted because the ruler of the second house is the Venus in the opposition to the Uranus. That is what we call an afflicted ruler of the second house. Even if you are a Uranus denier and you don't think that Uranus does anything, we still have Venus within the sign of her detriment, which is saying that the ruler of the second house within this chart is afflicted. So here we have two corroborative factors. One, the South Node in the second house, which is putting a very real hole within the national budget within this year, which is saying that nationally there could be a larger sense of the realities of what the national debt looks like. And the reality is that that debt has come to a place that isn't just overwhelming for the powers that be and for the heads of state, but it's also overwhelming on the ground for the actual American people. So that's one of the things we find with the South Node being present here within the second house. And as a further corroboration of this, we have the ruler of the second house as Venus in the third house. Now, this is starting to feel like a traditional astrology masterclass, and maybe that's what it is. But determination by location is immediate. We have the ruler of the second house in the third house, and the third house is representing the news and how we speak about the news within our general national agenda. Having the ruler of the second house in the third house could be an indication that money and the budget and the state of the money of the country is the major thing that we're seeing manifesting within the news this year. So one, we find real estate, property, real estate taxes, property taxes becoming a major part of the news agenda. We also find the quality of the soil and whether or not that soil has the ability to support crops that are homegrown, also becoming a part of the national agenda. But here, with the ruler of the second house in the third house of news, we also have this idea of the money and the challenging state that the money of the country might be in, also becoming a part of the national agenda within this coming period of time. So all of these things are relevant and all of these things are significant. And once again, we do have the Venus in the opposition relationship with the Uranus, and Venus opposite Uranus, it means a couple of things from a planet to planet based perspective, but within a traditional context, it could have to do with instability of the money of the country within this coming period of time. If I were the astrologer to the king, which is no longer a professional title because nobody is the astrologer to the king anymore, unless you live in India where they do have a state astrologer. But if I were the astrologer to the king and the king were to ask me, my faithful astrologer, where is the instability to the national money coming from within this coming period of time? I would take a look at where that Uranus is placed within the chart of this Capricorn ingress. And here we have Uranus in the ninth house. As we all must know, the ninth house has to do with international everything and foreign everything. So the ninth house has to do with our involvement in international affairs, in other people's affairs. All of these things are very ninth house topics. I remember in the year before the war in the Ukraine started, I did an Aries Ingress report in-house at Oraculos for the students of Oraculos, and I never published that anywhere. But I spoke within that Aries Ingress about how war will break out within another country and how the US will financially be supporting that war and how the US will place its money too deeply within the pockets of those other people to the detriment of the US's own economy. And I spoke about that. I never published it. And then driving home one day from school, on the radio, we heard that war broke out in the Ukraine and that the US was largely funding the restitution of the Ukrainian people and the aiding of the Ukrainian people in terms of weaponry and all of these things. And that was the year when that broke out. A year when it didn't even seem likely that there would be any war topic because we were still in the middle of talking about the pandemic. And within that, the war in the Ukraine started. So this year, I feel that much more emboldened, as it were, to speak about the fact that having the Uranus here within the ninth house, afflicting the Venus, which is the ruler of the money of the country this year, is an indication of the fact that the primary source of the financial instability that is experienced on the ground within the country this year has to do with the US's relationship with foreign countries and possibly even the US's aiding financially the issues going on abroad or the issues going on within foreign countries. And we see this further corroborated because we have the second house and the ninth house are being ruled by the same Venus. And this can be an indication that the money of the country, second house, and the foreign ties of the country, ninth house, are deeply connected, but that is what's causing this large state of financial instability for the country within this coming period. So that's something else we see predicted within this Capricorn ingress chart. As a further point of corroboration, we have the power to fortune in the ninth house. Somebody asked me the other day, Mychal, what does the power to fortune mean? In traditional astrology, the power to fortune has always been a secondary proxy of our money. So the power to fortune in the ninth house is only a further corroboration of the money going to issues going on abroad, but also Venus opposite the Uranus could be indicative of the fact that those issues going on abroad are fundamentally destabilizing for the actual budget of the country within this coming year, 2024. Now, to wrap this up, another thing that I found to be significant about this, as far as the international piece of things is concerned, is that we also have the ruler of the fourth house, and the ruler of the fourth house, which is technically representing the land of the people or the land of the country of America, is also in the ninth house. And that can be an indication that the physical property of the United States of America feel as if it's being allocated to others. And sometimes that can look as if other people are making investments into the country, such as foreigners investing heavily on US soil, to the point of them possibly even being owners of large portions of US soil. This could definitely be a thing that we see manifesting within this period, but possibly this sense of the land of the people being given away to people who aren't necessarily from here could be a major source of contention on the ground, which brings us back to the Mars in the fourth house this year. So these are some of the major things that I think are significant for us to talk about within this traditional Capricorn ingress chart. Now we're going to take a look at what some of these combinations are indicating from a planet-to-planet based perspective. Not the perspective of the houses they rule, but primarily from a planet-to-planet based perspective. We have Mars in this chart in a square relationship with Neptune. Mars at 20 degrees Sagittarius is applying to his sinister square of Neptune at 24 degrees of Pisces, 57 minutes in the seventh house. Having Neptune in the seventh house is interesting because from a mundane perspective, the two houses that have to do with people abroad are the seventh house and the ninth house. So having Neptune in the seventh house could be indicative of one of two things. On the one hand, it says that people abroad are in a state of need or in a state of dissolvement or in a state of disillusionment and they need help, they genuinely need support because Neptune is a toilet bowl. So this could be a devitalizing impact on people abroad. And as a result of those people abroad being in the state of devitalization that they're in, that then becomes a US-based problem where the US feels as if it has to step in and assist. Now, I think what's interesting about that is that the Mars is in a square relationship with that Neptune. Stepping back one moment into a traditional perspective, this Mars is also ruling the 8th house, and the 8th house also has to do with the money of those people abroad. And so this Mars in the square relationship with Neptune can say that the money of the people abroad is being wasted and lost and done away with. And therefore, the real source of debt on the ground for the American people becomes somebody else's insobriety with their own national money. So this is seeming like the problem that is causing potential conflicts and arguments on the ground within the US this year has to do with the way in which the US is stepping in to financially aid people who weren't even conscientious about spending their own money. So this becomes a major topic that we see manifesting within this year. Now, Mars, Neptune also has to do with epidemics. And when we read The Combinations of Stellar Influences by Reinhold Eberton, Mars, Neptune is one of the combinations that we look for as far as challenges related to health are concerned within the chart of a person, because Mars Neptune has to do with low health and weakened vitality. So the fact that this combination is angular within this coming year also has to do with the fact that the topic of poor health can also be a very high priority or a very high topic within the mind of the American people this year, because Mars Neptune is the combination that represents epidemics. And so this could represent another very large health challenge that we see manifesting on the ground. That, on the one hand, is a global issue because the Mars square Neptune isn't just an American problem. The Mars square Neptune is Mars square Neptune for this entire year for the entire world. So therefore, the Mars square Neptune becomes a global problem, but it is also a problem that is directly having a very major impact on the United States of America as a result of it happening from angular houses. To call a spade, another thing that oftentimes happens within natal astrology, especially when Neptune is conjunct the 7th house cusp, is people start to have idealizations and illusions about their significant others. Now, this isn't a natal astrology chart. This is a mundane astrology chart. So we can say that this could represent the US having delusions and illusions and an idealized state of fantasy regarding its significant others in terms of foreign allies. And very often when we meet people under Neptune conjunct our 7th house cusp, whether that is by transit or solar art direction, secondary direction, you name it. When we have this Neptune on the 7th, we enter a relationship because it looks fine and lovely and beautiful and it makes us feel good inside. But it doesn't take very long until that relationship turns up as a disaster, or until that relationship ends up being a very disappointing thing in general. So usually when a person has Neptune on their 7th, we want them to practice an extra level of discernment and discrimination when it comes to who they get into bed with. However, very often they come to us after having already gotten into bed with those people and after already having been betrayed by those people. So this year, the Neptune in the 7th doesn't necessarily bode well in terms of the foreign allies who the US might be making for itself, because the US may not even be seeing their foreign allies in a very clear way. And as a result of not seeing their foreign allies in a very clear way, they might be inclined to think that their foreign allies, when they fart flakes of gold, without realizing that when their foreign allies fart, it's just as atrocious as everyone else's. And this could be something that we find manifesting within this year, this sense of a national disillusionment or a national sense of disappointment in terms of who the United States of America has chosen to ally itself with within the coming 12-month period. Now, I think the other major thing that we see going on within this chart that is significant is the fact that we have the Venus in opposition with Uranus. Now, Venus opposite Uranus is significant because of all of the things I've said previously, but it's also significant because Venus, as we know, has to do with women from a universal perspective. And to a very large degree, Venus has to do with women's rights from a mundane astrological perspective. And so when we have Venus-Uranus contacts like what we have going on within this chart, it can indicate that there is this heightened focus on the rights of women, and this heightened focus on women's sovereignty over their own affairs as well as over their own lives. And when we have Uranus tied into this, there can manifest a very real sense of injustice or a very real sense of cruelty as far as the rights of women are concerned, because the Venus-Uranus contact says that there is a sense of coldness or disregard that's manifesting on the ground as far as women's issues are concerned, and it may not actually leave women feeling supported, and it may not actually leave women feeling as if their voices have been heard within the coming period of time. So the Venus-Uranus has to do with the financial implications that we clearly see represented within this chart, but it also has to do with the rights of women, and it also has to do with certain injustices that we might find ourselves being privy to as far as women's rights are concerned within this coming 12-month period. Now, the very last thing worth considering within this chart, because it's a thing that I always consider, is the declination table. And the declination table shows us the relationship that planets have by declination. And once again, I started off this forecast by saying that when the sun ingresses into Capricorn, the sun attains his furthest southern declination within the course of the year. Similar to when the sun ingresses into Cancer, the sun attains his highest northern declination in the course of a year. And what that means is that if this is the celestial equator, when the sun is in Cancer, the sun is as high from the celestial equator as possible. And when the sun is in Capricorn, the sun is as low from the celestial equator as possible. So that's what declination is. Declination is measurement north or south of the celestial equator. It's a very important thing for us to bring into our astrology. And the reason for that is because when planets are combined by declination, it's just a big deal. When planets are combined by declination, it fundamentally means that those planets are operating with the same level of strength as they would operate if those planets were in a conjunction or an opposition. Therefore, declination is a huge deal, and we should not ignore declination, not from a mundane astrological perspective, and definitely also not from a natal astrological perspective. So within this chart, the very first thing that we see by declination is this is Jupiter in a parallel relationship with the moon. Or rather, let me say that differently, because we're intelligent astrologers and we practice intelligent astrology where the faster moving planet is the one that's doing the thing. So within this chart on the declination table, we see that we have the moon in a parallel relationship with Jupiter. Moon Jupiter, from a planet to planet based perspective, is the combination of motherhood and pregnancy. We see the moon Jupiter parallel is in a contraparallel relationship with Saturn. And Saturn afflicting the moon Jupiter parallel could say that there are very real issues that are manifesting within the world at large regarding the topic of pregnancy, regarding the topic of motherhood, regarding the topic of conception and childbirth and all of these things. So Saturn afflicting this can sometimes, from a natal perspective, if we have Saturn on the moon Jupiter midpoint, then that can indicate there being difficulties in terms of getting pregnant, difficulties in terms of conception. And sometimes it could be a thing that is denying childbirth altogether, because Saturn, as we know, also isn't conducive to children or fecundity or fertility in general. So on the one hand, we could say that this could be speaking about a very challenging period in terms of childbirth. However, as we all know, in general, it tends to be a thing where it's not really that difficult to get pregnant. And I'm not speaking about this from an individual perspective, I'm speaking about this as a global concept. When we think about pregnancy, it tends to be a pretty straightforward scenario. So therefore, speaking about this as it being a year where women are finding it difficult to be pregnant probably isn't where it's going to fall. This more so has to do with the piece I was speaking about earlier in terms of the Venus in the oppositional relationship with the Uranus, whereas women's rights surrounding pregnancy become very blocked, or women's rights surrounding their reproductive health becomes very blocked or very stagnant or very complicated or very problematic and contentious as a result of the Saturn being a part of this combination. Now, the final thing I will say about this, with the Jupiter essentially being in a contraparallel relationship with Saturn, is that Jupiter and Saturn together have to do with real estate. So here we see another thing that's manifesting and saying that real estate is going to be a very big ticket item within this coming year. And that's just another corroborative piece of that topic that we spoke about earlier. Now, the very last thing we see happening on this declination table is that the Sun is in a parallel relationship with Mars and also in a parallel relationship with Pluto. Mars-Pluto is the combination of amputation. And when we think about amputation, we think about the severance of one part of a body from the larger whole of that body. So, from a mundane perspective, this doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be a year where amputations are on the rise, but it could mean that this is going to be a contentious year. Mars, Sun has to do with the manifestation of violence or physical warfare. So, this could be an indication that this year is going to be a very contentious, rowdy, argumentative, potentially violent, potentially warlike year on the ground in general. And adding the Pluto to that only further increases the level of angst that we have around this topic. Whenever we add Pluto to anything, we add a force that causes abnormal growth within that thing. So adding Pluto to this Mars-Sun combination creates an abnormality surrounding the Martian piece of things. And the Martian piece of things is 1, bravery, 2, courage, 3, independence, but all of us feeling the need to become more brave and more courageous and more independent. When we add Pluto to that, it creates an abnormal need for independence, an abnormal emphasis on courage, an abnormal emphasis on bravery. And sometimes when someone is feeling too courageous and too brave, they try to pick fights where fights do not need to be picked to begin with. So this year is feeling like a continuation of the year that we currently find ourselves in as far as the topics of war and contention are concerned. And with the Mars-Sun-Pluto parallel, this could be an indication to us that these topics are only going to further increase as we move deeper into the year 2024. It's a very challenging set of things that we see within this ingress chart. 1, from the perspective of the chart itself, but 2, also from the perspective of some of these planet-to-planet based relationships. Based on what we've seen thus far, we've seen a continuation and an exacerbation of some of these very real challenges that we've already been facing within the United States of America. And this chart only looks like a continuation of more of the same. With that being said, we're going to dive into our Uranian astrology forecast for 2024. And just to remind you, this entire production is meant to not only introduce you more to Uranian astrology, but also to invite you to join us in our upcoming Uranian Astrology for Practicing Astrologers Intensive, which begins this coming January 30th, 2024, in which we will be talking about everything that we've spoken about today. And the first place we start really learning Uranian astrology is through the study of mundane events. So if you've been on the edge of your seat in terms of this forecast thus far, that is literally what learning Uranian astrology is like, because we take all of our knowledge of Uranian astrology and apply it to mundane events first before we apply it to understanding the natal chart specifically. So we have a fascinating program in store for you, and I can't wait for all of you to join us. So please do check out our website at www.oraculosastrology.com so that you can be a part of our upcoming Uranian astrology for practicing astrologers intensive. All right, so here on the screen we have what is known as the 360-degree dial, and we're going to be using this dial primarily as a means of searching for some of those topics and themes that we found within our traditional astrology chart. So the first place we start when we're looking at a dial is we always take a look at the cardinal cross. And the cardinal cross is 0 degrees of all of the cardinal signs. So here you can see the big pointer pointing at 0 degrees of Cancer. But what that essentially means is we have the dial focused on the cardinal axis. And why that's important is because this pointer moves. And we can move this pointer around and it shows us the various planetary combinations that exist within this. The most important thing we do when we take a look at the dial is we look and we see, are there any other things that are falling on this cross, whether they're falling on any of the other pointers or whether they're falling on any of these smaller dots. And if something is falling on a pointer or if something is falling on a dot, then we consider that thing to be essentially operating with whatever the pointer is pointing on. So for example, we have the pointer pointing on 0 degrees Cancer, and here we have the midheaven landing on this tiny dot in relationship to that 0 degrees Cancer, and that says that the midheaven is on the world axis. Now, why that's important is because on this dial and in Uranian astrology, the only things that set one person's chart apart from another person's chart, if those two people were born on the same time, on the same day, but in different locations, is the angles of their midheaven and their ascendant, because the rest of the planetary configurations that we see within this chart are going to be exactly the same for everyone. So the midheaven and the ascendant within this are the two things that makes this specifically the Capricorn ingress for Washington, D.C., as opposed to the Capricorn ingress for Nassau, Bahamas. So here we have the midheaven landing on this cardinal axis. And what that fundamentally means is that the midheaven of America is brought into the world at large. And in order to understand what that means, we have to know what the midheaven means by itself from a planet-to-planet based perspective. The midheaven represents the soul of whoever the chart belongs to. So having this midheaven attached to the cardinal axis is saying that the soul of the country, the soul of America, the soul of the American people is being brought onto the world stage at large within this coming period of time. Now, in order for us to see whether or not that's happening in a positive way or a negative way, we have to see what other aspects and what other planets are attached to that midheaven. But in general, this is already telling us that the US is going to be a major player within the world at large within this coming Capricorn ingress. Now, that might seem like a non-starter because which year is the US not a major player within the world at large within any ingress? But the reality is that we already see something that's saying to us that the entire world at large is going to be paying more attention to the United States and what the United States is going to be doing, not just within the next 3-month period, which corresponds with this Capricorn ingress, but with the coming year in general. So now we want to go and investigate on the dial what are some of the things that are going to be occurring so that we can see the quality of how the US is going to show up on the world stage within this coming year. Before we take the dial for a spin, we see the midheaven is standing on the dot, but we also see the node, that is the moon's node in red. The node is also basically standing on the dot as well. In Uranian astrology, the moon's nodes And we say the node specifically because we only use the north node of the moon in Uranian astrology. And that's because we only use hard aspects in Uranian astrology. And as we know, the nodes of the moon are always going to be opposite each other. Therefore, basically, whatever we'll say about one node, we can say about the next node, which is why we only use the one node glyph of the moon within Uranian astrology, that being the north node. So here, what this is highlighting is my connections. And that's because the nodes represent our intimate connections in general. And the reason for that is because the nodes represent the crossing points of the paths of the sun and the moon. And there's nothing more intimate than the sun and the moon. Therefore, the nodes represent our intimate connections, and the midheaven always represents the word my wherever we find it within a planet-to-planet based perspective. So the midheaven node is saying that my connections are being highlighted on the world stage within this coming year. Who is the my that's being spoken about? The my is the United States of America. So here we already see a further corroboration that my connections, or the connections of the US, are being highlighted within the world at large. And so my synopsis of this was that this year the US will have to pay a great deal of attention to how it's showing up in the world at large, and also the intimate connections it is making within the world at large, which is something that we already saw from the traditional astrological chart. So the question becomes, how is the US manifesting as a global citizen? Because this will be one of the major concerns for the country within this coming period. Now, as we move around this dial, I'm going to move around this dial at increments of 11 degrees and 15 minutes, because moving at that rate will show me more hard aspect relationships that we don't currently see based on having the pointer at its exact location. So I'm going to move this pointer around at increments of 11 degrees and 15 minutes to see what other hard aspect combinations are manifesting this year. Now, the first thing we see as we move the pointer around is Venus, Saturn is having a relationship to the cardinal axis as well. Venus, as we remember, has to do with women's rights. And Saturn, as we remember, has to do with blockades and restriction and obstruction and things that get in the way and things that seem to oppress and depress us in general. So having Venus and Saturn connected to the cardinal axis in this way is a further testimony of what we already saw within the natal chart due to the Venus opposite Uranus. The technical textbook definition of Venus-Saturn is divorce or separation in love or love's sorrow. And so Venus-Saturn from a mundane astrological perspective can have to do with the severance of alliances or letting go of previous relationships that once were very important. So within this coming period of time, there could be a sense of the alliances between nations are being severed, or the alliances between the heads of nations are being severed, and that becomes a very major topic within the coming year. Now, what I wrote about this was that the Venus-Saturn on the Aries point, because like I said, this is still having to do with the cardinal axis, has to do with separation of relationships within the world at large. But because Venus also has to do with women specifically, it can have to do with a depressed female population. We get the word depression from the Saturn, and we get the concept of female population from the Venus. So once again, this can be another thing that's indicating that female rights or women's rights becomes a very major topic within the unfolding of the year ahead. Our textbook for Uranian astrology, The Rules for Planetary Pictures, says that Venus-Saturn on the cardinal axis has to do with divorces in general. But I think that divorces, when we expand that onto the world stage, more so has to do with the separation of alliances that exist between countries. So that's something that we could see manifesting within this coming period of time. Now, we also have Vulcanus, which is this planet over here, falling on this axis. I'm going to put a circle around it. And Vulcanus is sounding like the word volcano, But Vulcanus also tends to be something that magnifies anything that it's connected to. So Vulcanus standing on the Venus-Saturn axis is magnifying this idea of the issues that we have within the realm of female rights and female reproductive rights in general, but also issues that we're having within the realm of peace specifically. And so the Venus-Saturn-Vulcanus combination has to do with disharmonies in an otherwise great love. So once again, we see this other testimony of there being challenges in terms of relationships in general, and not just relationships on a personal level, but relationships that are manifesting within the world at large. Now, as we go on through this, the next combination that we see manifesting here is we've gone another 11 degrees, 15 minutes around the dial. And here we now see Venus-Neptune. The Venus-Neptune midpoint is being highlighted, but also the Zeus node midpoint is being highlighted. Like I said earlier, when we have Neptune in the 7th house, that oftentimes has to do with disappointment in love. However, very often when we have Neptune in the 7th house, we could pretty much interpret that in the same way that we would interpret a Venus-Neptune combination. And Venus-Neptune is the combination of disappointment in love. It's the combination of becoming so gung-ho about a particular love relationship that we don't even realize that that love relationship doesn't mean us any well until it's too late. So the Venus-Neptune combination has to do with sobering down our love expectations, especially after we have collectively been so deeply invested in those relationships that we didn't even see them clearly. And so this is indicating that once again, not just on the ground in the US, because this also has to do with the world at large at this point, but we also see the midheaven connected to this combination, which is saying that the United States of America is going through this Venus-Neptune moment of disappointment in terms of its intimate relationships. So that's one way how this is manifesting. Another way how this could be manifesting, if we use Venus as our universal significator of women specifically, is Venus-Neptune can also be giving us insights into some of the challenges that women are facing again, that once again leaves them feeling a bit more depressed or a bit more let down or disappointed, particularly as far as policy is concerned regarding their rights. So this is something that we see happening within the world at large, and what makes it a personal homegrown issue is the fact that we also have the midheaven connected to this combination. Now, the next thing that we have connected to this is the node Zeus combination. Zeus is one of our Uranian astrology planets, and Zeus has to do with great power or directed power, which is why Zeus has to do with firearms and missiles and rockets and things that represent a controlled expression or a controlled explosion of power within the world. So Zeus tends to have to do with weapons of war in general. And the node Zeus combination, I wrote that this has to do with flammable connections within the world at large. We also like Zeus because it has to do with creativity. And so this could also have to do with creative leadership. But in general, it tends to signify the inflammation of the people, or the people who feel ready to fight, or the people who are armed, or who feel ready to go to war, because Zeus is a planet that we oftentimes find coming up within periods of war. The node Zeus also has to do with us making connections with firearms and weapons within the world in general. I think I heard once that Zeus was a very prominent factor within the chart of the establishment of the NRA in the United States of America. So possibly this could be another year in which we find this idea of weapons and guns becoming a very major topic that catches the entire attention, not just of the world in general, but specifically of the US as a result of the midheaven standing on this combination. Now, moving on through, another piece I wrote about the Venus-Neptune on the Aries point, or standing on the world axis, has to do with deceit or deception in love in the general public. So once again, we see this other combination that has to do with the dissolving of our intimate connections on a national level. And I think the message within this is that as we move into 2024, collectively, globally, but particularly as a nation, it's giving us this sense of we all need to practice that much more discernment, and we all need to practice that much more maturity in terms of our connections with other people. And we really need to know when those connections are infringing our own rights and our own abilities to take care of ourselves. Because sometimes under Venus Neptune, we can give somebody the shirt off of our back, but this year is definitely not looking like an appropriate year for us to be engaging in that sort of behavior. So my synopsis of this was that firearms and guns in general could become a major topic within the world this year. And I made a note of the NRA. And it also has to do with groups of people who have firearms as their common point of union and agreement. So once again, that's bringing up this highlight of firearms being a major topic within the year in general. One of our midpoints that has to do with pregnancy is the Venus-Zeus midpoint, because Zeus also has to do with procreation. It has to do with creation, but it also has to do with procreation. So having the Zeus node combination can also indicate that matters of procreation become a major highlight within the coming year. Now we're going to move on around the dial to see what other factors we have coming up. Another factor that we have coming up this year is the moon and Apollon. This planet over here is Apollon, which is one of our 8 Uranian astrology planets. So we have the moon Apollon coming up strongly, and we have the moon Apollon midpoint being occupied by the Vulcanus, and we also have the node Poseidon midpoint being occupied by that Vulcanus as well. So what I wrote about the moon Apollon equaling Vulcanus is that this has to do with the international general public. The reason for this is because Apollon has to do with our foreign connections, our connections with people far and wide, and the moon, as we know, is the universal significator of the general public specifically. So the moon Apollon, I wrote, has to do with the international general public, or international affairs of many people from around the world becomes a major topic within this year, particularly on the ground within the US. And I wrote that the issues of people from around the world become magnified within this coming year. And the moon Apollon from the rules for planetary pictures has to do with a multitude of people. But something I thought was interesting is it also has to do with the dispersing of people or the spreading of people. And I think that one of the things that we find happening at this moment, particularly within the Middle East, is that we find many people who are currently being displaced. And while that seems to be a Middle Eastern issue at the moment, this can also be something that is having a much larger impact on the world at large. In 2020, when a lot of us heard about the coronavirus, we thought that it was just an issue that was localized to a tiny fishing village in Wuhan, China. And then that quickly became a larger issue that impacted the world at large. So within this year, we have the sort of combination that is saying that the issues of international groups of people becomes magnified to the point of it also becoming a larger topic. And my point that I wrote here was that this can be a year where the dispersing of people becomes a massive issue within the world. Having Vulcanus a part of this also speaks about the power that the people have within themselves. So my note about this was that the power of the people becomes magnified within this period, and the world realizes that the common person, that the civilian is the person who actually has the greater power to impact change and not necessarily the government that govern those people. And I think just standing from the perspective that we're in the year 2023, this December, we've seen so much action that has been grown from the ground within civilians that has forced the hands of policymakers to actually do the right thing, or to actually do things that represent the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. And we find the extension of this going into the year 2024. Moon Apollon also has to do with a group of people who have foresight or who have the ability to see into the future. So this year, once again, there's this idea that civilians in general, they have this far-sightedness, but international groups of people also have this goal orientation that's allowing them to see beyond this present moment to seeing more towards the future and what the outcome of their present actions are on the future. And I think that there's a lot happening within our world right now that is highlighting this idea that there is a lot of action that's being taken up from a civilian level that is going to have far-reaching repercussions into the future. Now, the Node Poseidon combination here has to do with our spiritual connections. Poseidon having to do with spirituality and the Node having to do with our connections. What I wrote about this was that the religion of the American people becomes strongly highlighted and discussed within this coming year. So this isn't just a political year, but it's also seeming as if religion is also being a major highlight and the impact that religion has, not just on the country, but also the impact that religion has on how we correspond with or how we interact with international groups and bodies of people within this coming period of time. Now, the next combination that we have here is the Mercury node combination. And we also have that standing with the Poseidon midheaven. Midheaven, once again, always has to do with me, my, and Poseidon has to do with religion. So midheaven Poseidon has to do with my religion or the religion of the American people being a very highlighted topic within this coming year. We also find Vulcanus there, which is further increasing the emphasis on religion and the religion of the people within this coming period of time. Now we have the node Mercury combination, and we even have the Chiron Cupido combination. We don't have a book that teaches us about Chiron Cupido, but I wrote down my own interpretation about what I think that means. So the Mercury node combination has to do with us speaking, essentially, and it has to do with the fact that religion, midheaven Poseidon, is going to be the major thing that's spoken about Mercury node within this coming period of time. And particularly, what role religion plays within the larger sense of how policy is made on the ground within America. Now, for the Chiron Cupido, what I wrote about that was that Chiron Cupido can have to do with the sick or broken family unit, which also becomes a theme within this coming year. Religious discussions may be primarily about the deterioration of the family unit and or of nationalism. And I say nationalism because Cupido also has to do with a sense of clannishness and tribalism and nationalism. So religious discussion may be primarily about the deterioration coming from Chiron of the family unit, which comes from Cupido. And so all of these events and all of these topics are heavily highlighted this year because of the Vulcanus falling on that combination. We move through, and the next thing that we see here is the Chiron-Pluto combination, which I didn't actually write anything about, but we do see that the Chiron-Pluto is standing with the midheaven. Chiron, for me, feels like the coming together of Saturn-Neptune. And Saturn-Neptune is one of the challenging combinations that we find from a medical astrology perspective, because Saturn and Neptune in combination can be very debilitating to the health of a person. So having Chiron and Pluto standing with the midheaven within this coming period of time can speak about abnormal, which is our Plutonian word, health issues being the Chiron word. So abnormal health issues, Chiron-Pluto, becomes a very large topic for the people of America within this coming year of 2024, based on having the midheaven standing on that combination. Moving on through to the next thing that we see within this is the midheaven and the sun. Midheaven and the sun. The sun, as we all know, is the universal significator of the king or the elected government official. And speaking about elected government officials, Zeus node, which was a combination that we saw a while back, also has to do with electing people and this idea of elections in general. And we know that this year, 2024, is going to be a major period within the election history of the United States of America. So we do have this election piece coming up with the Node Zeus combination. And we see this further highlighted with the midheaven sun combination, which has to do with my king or with my president, because the midheaven is the my and the sun is the king or the president. So this can be an indication once again that the king or the president or the leadership, the government, those in positions of power within the US this year are going to not just be in positions of power, but they're going to be in very highlighted positions of power because of the Volcanus as a part of this combination. And we hope that those in power are doing right by the people. The next thing that we have is Saturn Uranus falling on this as well. And we have Volcanus over here standing with the Saturn Uranus. And what I wrote about this is that Saturn Uranus has to do with the breaking apart of the old world order and replacing it with something new. I wrote that it has to do with us kicking against our upbringing, essentially, because Saturn represents our old orthodox fundamentalist views and perspectives about how the world should operate. And the Saturn-Uranus combination has to do with us fighting against some of those old fundamentalist conservative views. On the Aries point, or standing on the cardinal axis, I wrote that this has to do with the breaking apart of orthodox, conservative, conventional systems of government within the world at large. And this can also have to do with the falling of a very ultra-orthodox worldview. Our book, The Rules for Planetary Pictures, said that Saturn-Uranus, standing on the world axis, has to do with quarrels or sudden separations, and it also has to do with rigidity. But standing on the Aries point, this is a piece of corroboration that we saw in the traditional chart, because standing on the Aries point, it has to do with sudden events that result in the loss of property. So we saw this traditionally speaking, and we also are seeing this from a Uranian astrology perspective, this idea of there being sudden loss of property or sudden issues that shake and that jar our relationship to real estate in general within this coming period of time. Moving on through on this combination, we also have the Uranus-Neptune combination standing with the Pluto-Chronos. Uranus-Neptune is one of our combinations in Uranian astrology and just in any planet-to-planet based astrology that has to do with the elimination of waking consciousness. Sometimes when people have Uranus and Neptune afflicting very important parts of their charts, it can have to do with people who suffer from blackouts, who have lost massive chunks of their memory as a result of the impact that blackouts have had on their minds in general, because Uranus and Neptune together has to do with the elimination of waking consciousness. Uranus and Neptune has to do with death, or to depart from this physical realm. What I wrote about that standing with the Aries point is that death becomes a major highlight within the world at large. And once again, we see this standing with the midheaven, which is saying that this is once again a homegrown problem. There's more I can say about that, but I think that the midheaven being a part of this is saying that it feels as if America is having a major role to play in this larger topic of death and how death is manifesting not just on the ground, but also in the world at large. Pluto and Chronos are also standing on this combination. And Pluto and Chronos has to do with the changing of the government. Pluto has to do with change. Chronos has to do with the government. So Pluto Chronos has to do with the changing of the government, but it also has to do with abnormal power of the government, or the government who is taking more of an autocratic stance where they aren't actually listening to the things going on the ground, and they're not actually listening to the needs and the concerns of the people. And so this is seeming like a year where the democracy is seeming as if it's taking more of an autocratic direction. Those are the main combinations that we see in terms of the Uranus-Neptune and the Pluto-Chronos standing together. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about in terms of this combination is that we also have the Moon-Chiron standing on this. And Moon-Chiron standing on this combination has to do with the sick people. Chiron gives us the word sick, and the moon gives us the word people. So once again, we see this health theme manifesting within 2024 as a result of the moon, which represents people in general, and Chiron, which tends to have more to do with things that diminish our health than it has to do with things that support our health. The next combination that we do see is Uranus and Admetos standing together. My definition of that is the shaking of the earth, and I put in parentheses earthquakes. When my research team and I looked for this within Rules for Planetary Pictures, here's what we found. Rules for Planetary Pictures says that Uranus Admetos has to do with sudden rupture like separation, shock, commotion, destruction through convulsion, earthquakes, to break off, to break up, to break down, to tear up. All of these things are found under the auspices of Uranus Admetos. Now, we know that we've gone through a period of very intense earthquakes within the world in general, and we know that the intensity of those earthquakes has been a major part of what's resulted in the current volcano that's erupted in Iceland. So we see this theme of earthquakes already manifesting and already having manifested within the last portion of this year. But with this coming up within the Capricorn ingress chart, there can be a continuation of this, that the tectonic action that we see happening in Iceland is actually part of a much larger change that's happening on our planet in terms of larger geological and geocosmic events. So maybe the earthquakes in Iceland is an isolated topic. However, this Uranus Admetos isn't for the last ingress chart, it's actually for this upcoming ingress chart. So this can also be a year where we're hearing about massive earthquakes as well. And the reason for that is because Vulcanus is standing on this combination. And with Vulcanus standing on the earthquake combination, we get the sense that any earthquakes that are going to happen are going to be that much larger within the coming period. Now, moving on through, something that I do like about this combination is that we see that we have the moon Kronos standing on the midheaven. Moon Kronos has to do with female leaders. And as far as the United States of America is concerned, with the midheaven attached to that, this has to do with my, which comes from the midheaven, female leaders, which comes from the moon Kronos. So this can be an indication that there are more women who are occupying roles of authority and government within this coming year. And this can have to do with a female leader rising to the top of the governmental food chain within the United States of America within this coming year of 2024. So I think this is an interesting combination. And there has been talk within the astrological community about the charts of Kamala Harris as well as Joe Biden, and about how Kamala Harris's chart is more connected to this Capricorn ingress chart for the year ahead than even Joe Biden's chart. So within this Capricorn ingress chart, we do see this indication of the rising to power of females or of women within positions of governmental authority as a result of the moon Kronos standing with the midheaven. And what I wrote about this was that has to do with my female president. Moon Kronos equals midheaven. And on an individual level, it can also have to do with my female boss as well. So these are the major things that we see standing on the cardinal axis within this year. And we don't really see much more than that. From a mundane perspective, we would look at the cardinal axis, the midheaven, the ascendant, the moon, and the node. We can't look at the sun because the sun is standing on the cardinal axis. So if I put the pointer on the midheaven, what we end up with is the moon-Hades combination standing on the midheaven. Now, what makes this complicated and potentially problematic is that the midheaven is the most personal thing within this chart that's connected to the United States of America. And the moon-Hades combination isn't necessarily a combination that anybody enjoys. Hades, from a Uranian astrology perspective, has to do with the underworld and filth and poverty and destitution. And moon Hades has to do with the impoverished people or the poor people. And the midheaven attached to to that has to do with my impoverished people, my poor people. And so that can have to do with poverty within the country itself becoming an even larger topic within the coming year. And we saw some of that from the traditional chart as far as we had the ruler of the 8th house in the 4th house, which has to do with this increase of property taxes, which can really lean heavily onto the pockets and the budgets of people. And since we also have the node attached to this, this is midheaven, moon, Hades node. And the node has to do with my impoverished connections. The my comes from the midheaven, the impoverished comes from the moon Hades, and the connections comes from the node. This can also have to do with the role that the US is playing in terms of poverty, not just homegrown poverty, but also poverty abroad. Since we know that the moon is one of our universal significators of women specifically, I wrote that the moon Hades equals midheaven combination says that the soul of the US is encountering sad women, which is a further corroboration of what we saw earlier, both from the traditional astrology perspective as well as from the dial. So my synopsis of this was that this year there seems to be an emphasis on financial challenges on the ground in the US, and there could be a real sense of financial lack where the people at this time do not feel as if they can attend to some of their basic needs and requirements. And this can create ugly feelings and emotions within the people of the country that they direct towards the government. And then the final thing I said about this combination with the moon Hades equals the node is that this can be a year where the intimate bonds that women share with each other become highlighted in the US because of issues that are challenging for the women of the country to digest. Women's rights issues can become strongly highlighted because the women, which is represented by the moon, may be feeling violated, which is represented by the Hades, or because women within the country are feeling as if they are lower class citizens, which has to do with the Hades as well. So this is a bit of a challenge as far as the manifestation of positive things in terms of women's rights are concerned, and this could be something that we see manifesting within this coming period of time. Now, the next thing is the ascendant. And on the ascendant axis, we see that the ascendant is running with the Hades Apollon, the sun Uranus, and the node Pluto. Hades, as we know, has to do with ugliness, and the Apollon has to do with internationality. So Hades Apollon can say that the US is the seat of a great amount of some of the financial problems that we see happening for people both locally and abroad. And the reason for that is because the ascendant is representing the actual realities of the latitude and the longitude of Washington, D.C. So this ascendant isn't just some flippant portion of this chart. This ascendant is what makes this Hades Apollon combination specifically having to do with Washington. So I wrote that the US is the seat of a great amount of poverty and financial problems for people locally and abroad, and international poverty becomes a major issue within the US this year, which we once again saw from the traditional chart, and the problem of other people's poverty becomes a national problem because Hades Apollon has to do with the poverty of the masses in general. The sun Uranus has to do with a shock to the system of the people on the ground. And the sun Uranus, I wrote, can be a rude awakening, becomes a theme of 2024. And this could have to do with a genuine sense of shock within the soul and the psyche of the people at this time. With the node Pluto, I wrote that when we think about Pluto, we have a laundry list of words we say about Pluto. Our grab word for Pluto tends to be transformation. So Pluto node could be transformation of our intimate connections. The intimate connections coming from the node and the transformation coming from the Pluto. But Pluto node also has to do with relationships which possibly take a fateful turn. And the book combinations of stellar influences, says that Pluto node as a combination has to do with the common and possibly tragic destiny shared with a multitude of people. So once again, we get this international ugliness coming through the Hades Apollon, but we get this common tragic destiny coming through the node Pluto manifesting firmly on the ground of the US within this coming year. So this does not seem to be a small topic. It actually seems to be a rather large topic. And once again, we see Zeus a part of this combination. And Zeus being a part of this combination, once again, has to do with not just leadership, but also with firearms. So here we have, again, firearms becoming a major topic on the ground within the US within this coming year. Now, moving on to the moon as our next major consideration. With the moon, we have the moon running in a square relationship with Pluto this year. That's a bit of a challenge. This is, on the one hand, a global consideration, but on the other hand, we see the US pulled in and being made a part of this as well, because we have the ascendant for Washington, D.C. running with Mars. Ascendant Mars has to do with angry people on the ground, and running with the moon, that could be angry women on the ground, is what we see with that. What I wrote about the ascendant Mars equaling the moon is that it represents angry women of the country. Mars moon is the angry women and the ascendant is of the country. So this can be a very heightened year as far as the anger of women is concerned, and as far as that becoming a major topic and a major theme within our news cycles within this coming period of time. Zeus Apollon running with the moon also has to do with international leadership over the affairs of women. International leadership has to do with the Apollon being international, leadership being the Zeus, and the moon being over the affairs of women specifically. So this is another piece that's manifesting. And then the moon Pluto by itself, as we know, Pluto has to do with metamorphosis, but sometimes it can have to do with painful metamorphosis. The moon Pluto can have to do with a painful period of transformation that forces all of us towards evolution within this coming year of 2024. So 2024 is giving us many amazing opportunities to evolve and grow, but it's also saying that that growth is going to have to be through things that don't necessarily feel the most comfortable in the world. And the final consideration within this entire thing is the node. And we've spoken about the node previously because the node is attached to the midheaven within this chart, but the node is also the final thing that we're going to look at on this dial as far as the Capricorn ingress forecast is concerned. And here we see the node running with the midheaven, which we already knew, but we also have the node running with the Pluto and the Hades. And what I wrote about that is that Pluto Hades has to do with the growth of ugliness. Pluto has to do with growth and Hades has to do with ugliness. And I also wrote that it has to do with the development of poverty, which occurs within my intimate connections. The development has to do with the Pluto, poverty comes from the Hades, and the intimate connections of the US has to do with the midheaven node. So the development of poverty, which occurs within my intimate connections. Our book, Rules for Planetary Pictures, says that Pluto Hades has to do with unreliable, failure to act, dishonesty, downfall, to be on the decline, an evil change, or the situation or condition that worsens. If we add the node to that combination, it has to do with connection with persons who disappoint us, people who fall short of our expectations, to be connected with untenable things, and eager for or thinking about remedial measures. And I think that this last piece, eager for or thinking about remedial measures, is largely the major theme that we see manifesting within this year, 2024. 2024 is coming in and is saying to us that a lot of the things that have been broken within our society seem to be exacerbated within the year ahead, and it seems as if those things may even continue to break. And as we look at a world that is moving in the direction of chaos, as we stand here already bearing witness to the chaos that is occurring around us, the crimes against humanity that are occurring around us. This 2024 is saying to us that we don't just get off easily by changing the threshold from one year to another year and saying new year, new me. But the reality of a lot of the pain and the destruction that has occurred just within this year of 2023 alone is something that we very much likely are going to continue to grapple with, and that we're very much likely going to have to continue to experience the repercussion of. So in the wake of that, the question becomes, how do we grow and evolve? In the wake of that, the question becomes, how do we create a better set of circumstances, not just for ourselves, but for others around us? How do we practice a greater sense of discernment, not just within ourselves, but also within our intimate relationships? How do we use the experiences that we've gone through already to grow and become wise? And these are the major topics that we see manifesting within this Capricorn ingress chart, whether we look at it from a traditional perspective or whether we look at it from a Uranian perspective. We hear the evidence of more of the same flowing between these two charts, and it's something that feels uncomfortable. And if you're uncomfortable by it, you should feel uncomfortable, because there's nothing that seems to be particularly easy about this coming period of time. However, one of my favorite verses in the Bible has always been, if you run with men on foot and they tire you out, how can you expect to run with horses? And I think that that verse is very applicable within this coming period of time, because this is a year that seems built to wear us out. This is a year that seems built to put us face to face with challenging circumstances so that we can actually see what the quality of our own resolve is. And if we don't dig our heels deep into some system of resolve, chances are the force of 2024 is such that it will definitely blow us away. So as we move into this new year, we're all reminded that we didn't come here accidentally, and that we didn't come into this world as outcasts, but we came into this world specifically with the intention to grow and become wise. And 2024 is giving us many opportunities to grow and become wise, not just within ourselves individually, but also within the world collectively. And I look forward to seeing you in 2024 and to helping you navigate 2024 through the use of this wonderful tool of astrology, which gives all of us the ability to prepare for the future. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me for our first Capricorn ingress reading. As you can see, it was very intense, but I do hope that you learned something from it, even if you're not using this as your major predictive tool for the year ahead. I do hope that you learned something in terms of the technique of mundane astrology from it, because I genuinely enjoy being able to share this content with you. If you love the work that we do here on the Oraculos Podcast, then please do subscribe to the Oraculos Podcast wherever you find us on the internet. If you're listening on YouTube, then please take a moment and hit the subscription button as well as the notification bell on YouTube so that you receive notifications of when we come out with these episodes on a weekly basis. Also, we're at the end of the year, which means we're doing our Spotify wrap, our Apple Podcasts wrap, our YouTube wrap. So if you haven't already followed us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, please do take a moment and follow us on those platforms as well. And if you love the work that we do here on the Oraculos Podcast, then please leave us a 5-star written review over on Apple Podcasts. I have never been a very beggy person. However, I've recently been made aware of the fact that the more high quality 5-star written reviews we have over on Apple Podcasts, the more that platform promotes the Oraculos Podcast to a wider listenership. So I'm asking you to please take a moment, and if you've benefited from anything that I do here on the Oraculos Podcast, please do go over on Apple Podcast, leave us a 5-star written review, letting people know what you love so much about this work that we're doing. I'm so happy to always be able to share astrological space with you. It means so much to me to be able to come here and share in this quality of astrology. And I think that in a world where astrology looks like so many things, it's important for us to still hold a space for concrete event-based astrology. And all of the astrology of the world is beautiful. And I do think that we all still need to connect ourselves deeply with versions of astrology that have the ability to concretely describe the events that are going to unfold within our lives. Not just talk about the energies or the themes, but to concretely describe events. And to that end, I am here to serve you into the year 2024 and beyond, so that we all continue to have these solid, tangible touchstones of concrete astrology within our lives. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of your astrological family, and thank you so much for being a part of mine. Until next time, I'm Mychal Bryan, leaving you in peace and love and hope. Until we meet again, have a good one. Bye-bye.